Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. My research focused on mapping out the neurons that control when you feel anxiety and potentially that predispose some people to becoming addicted to drugs like nicotine, opioids, alcohol, and potentially stimulants as well, actually. All right, so there was an article that was published in a journal called Biological Psychiatry, and I know this is probably like the least interesting thing that I include when I talk about these studies, but Biological Psychiatry is one of the more widely read journals in neuroscience, and therefore considered to be one of the most prestigious to publish in. So it's sort of like the difference between publishing in, the New York Times versus like a local newspaper. It doesn't necessarily mean that the articles in the local papers are any less relevant or important or, competently produced or written. Rather, it's just like a whole lot more people will read an article in the New York Times than they will in a local newspaper. And so it's likely to influence quite a few more people in the New York Times. So another comparison would be something sort of like, the difference between having a TV show on a major network versus, in public access or another channel that's, difficult to find and only reaches a handful of people. So Biological Psychiatry, right? And so here it is. And it's different. It's a different kind of like paper or publication than what I typically bring up on this channel. This is called a correspondence, okay? So it's not a totally full-fledged research article. It's not a full set of experiments. It's more of an observation or finding about which a team of scientists believes the rest of the field should be aware. Because it might spark some ideas or projects elsewhere, years before their own work, the complete work, will ultimately be concluded. So, okay, with that explained. So this is a publication that focuses on a drug called MDMA, okay? Methylene dioxymethamphetamine. You might know this molecule by a bunch of other nicknames. I think it's probably most regularly called Molly these days. But it might be second to like cannabis in terms of how many people use, or the names that people use to refer to MDMA. Old school names, things like, ecstasy or X, beans, rolls, and I'm sure there's all kinds of like weird regional, nicknames that aren't used throughout the whole country or the whole world. So if you're unfamiliar with the name, the chemical name for MDMA, methylene dioxymethamphetamine, you might have picked up on at least part of that chemical name, amphetamine or methamphetamine. So, points to anyone who can recognize the thing that distinguishes amphetamine from methamphetamine. But even if you've never taken, an organic chemistry class, you can probably tell that these are pretty similar shapes, these chemical structures. MDMA has the addition on the left side of the molecule. I suppose it's probably, the left side of the molecule for you. The thing that makes it almost look sort of like a turtle, that has a long tail or something like that. It's really the addition of that pentagon shape with those two oxygens, those two O's. What is a benzoyl or benzodioxyl? That's in the formal chemical name, the IUPAC name for any chemistry nerds. So that's MDMA, and it's that addition that causes MDMA to have particularly interesting pharmacology relative to its simpler amphetamine cousins. Simpler both structurally. But also pharmacologically, relative to MDMA, right? And so the pharmacology of amphetamine, and this will include methamphetamine as well, revolves almost entirely around what are called catecholamine neurotransmitters, dopamine, norepinephrine. By multiple mechanisms, pharmacological mechanisms, substances basically cause this like giant dump of dopamine and norepinephrine. And because of what those neurotransmitters regulate in terms of our behavior and our experience of our mood and stuff like that, people will tend to experience increased focus, increased motivation, and euphoria. And of course, like essentially all psychoactive substances, people will respond differently to these substances, but that's generally how people respond to amphetamine. Okay, for neurotypical people, someone using amphetamine recreationally might spend like 11 hours disassembling some piece of electronics or super meticulously cleaning some part of their home. And of course, for people who are diagnosed with ADHD, it seems that this effect, that specifically that dump of catecholamines or that dump of really dopamine, it seems that this effect, that specifically affects what's called the mesocortical limbic circuit in the brain, is what enables them, folks diagnosed with ADHD, to focus on a single task for longer than they'd find reasonable. without the availability of a medication like Adderall or also Ritalin, methylphenidate, which has pretty similar pharmacology, not identical, but pretty similar. All right, so these are the sort of basic skeletons, right, of MDMA, the sort of backdrop, the structural backdrop. But it has that addition of that little, interesting little, pentagon up there, which adds a whole dimension to the pharmacology of the substance. So relative to its amphetamine cousins, amphetamine, methamphetamine, MDMA causes a significantly higher effect on serotonin signaling and less of an effect on dopamine signaling, but it does still affect dopamine. So MDMA also actually binds serotonin receptors. And so it's sort of like masquerading as serotonin itself. You can sort of think of it that way, which causes a whole variety of additional effects beyond, just the elevation of serotonin concentrations, right? Beyond just like forcing the release of more serotonin. Because it binds serotonin receptors, it has additional effects. But like altogether, for anybody who's unfamiliar with MDMA, the general effects may seem kind of hard to really understand, just by like reading a description or hearing a description. But with that said, so MDMA generally induces a sort of general euphoria. And, euphoria is one of those words that like, it's about as flexible as a word can be when it comes to the effects of a drug, right, to neuropharmacology. But it's just a sort of general sense of happiness and satisfaction and excitedness mixed with a bit of stimulation that's, kind of sort of similar to the feeling of multiple cups of coffee maybe or espresso, right? It's not quite the same, but, just elevated energy, right? Hey, Scott, good to see you, man. And so the most distinct effect of MDMA is that people will tend to experience significantly elevated levels of empathy. And I'm fairly certain that it was MDMA that caused the adoption of a kind of new class of drugs or category of drugs called entactogens or empathogens, drugs that cause a very significant experience of feeling emotionally connected and open. And pretty significantly motivated to form deep social relationships. It's also pretty well known to induce pretty intense pupil dilation. And so, to be clear, MDMA is not the only drug or the only molecule that'll induce pupil dilation, right? But it's one of the sort of non-subjective, non-psychoactive components of the substance. So anyways, it's this relatively unique effect of increasing empathy that caused MDMA to become super popular. Like it surged in popularity in the 1980s and then also the 1990s, with all kinds of amusing branding and stuff. With like people referring to specific batches of the substance by like the stamps on tablets. Tablets is generally how people take them, and it was particularly popular in the underground rave scene. What were basically like dance parties where MDMA was particularly prevalent, with certain kind of categories of music tending to be associated with those events. But this surge in popularity led to the Rave Act in the United States, sponsored by then Senator Joe Biden, by the way, which when a form of the bill, it wasn't. The Rave Act itself is basically ended up being incorporated to another piece of legislation, but when it was ultimately passed as a part of a bigger package, it significantly increased the penalties, legal penalties associated with a whole variety of substances, including MDMA. So, fun little piece of substance-related, political history in the United States. All right, so those are straight up anime eyes. Yeah, it is kind of crazy, like how dilated those pupils can be. I mean, if you've ever seen somebody get a dilated, pupil exam or an eye exam, it's like that level. It's just like dinner plate sized pupils. And it's kind of like weird to it has an effect on you, right? As we all know, dilated pupils induce a sort of sense of just the different interaction, right? When you see somebody with dilated pupils. We can get into that at some point. If anybody's interested. So anyways, the pharmacology of MDMA is fairly complicated and frankly it's kind of unimportant to the story that we're going to explore in a minute. But the point is that this is a substance that's been the subject of quite a bit of law enforcement and regulatory attention, and so there's also a history of scientific publications, by the way, that were published that seem to at least exaggerate, and that's perhaps putting it mildly, exaggerate the potential toxic effects of the substance. And a sort of controversial story involving a former director of NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse here in the United States, and a retracted paper right? So, but broadly speaking, much like other categories of psychoactive substances, research into the effects of MDMA has just been significantly hampered by, intense scrutiny, by drug policy in the United States. And so, I do go into greater depth on this history and that specific sort of controversy in a podcast I recorded quite a while ago at this point, but I've linked it below and it's still applicable. So, we know that other substances, even legal substances, can induce a kind of predisposition to social interaction and empathy. And frankly, it's probably a major reason for why alcohol, a drug with, by the way, considerable negative public health consequences, is one of the most widely consumed drugs in the world. And, and that bars are one of the major points of socializing for people throughout the world, right? But there seems to be something unique to the effects of a substance or substances like MDMA relative to a substance like ethanol, particularly when it comes to the production of sustained changes in things like personality or social bonds, and even things as deeply rooted as political or religious views. So, just for example, there's a fairly justifiable reason that alcohol isn't considered to be like an ideal tool to treat psychiatric conditions, while MDMA actually has proven to have what appears to be pretty meaningful efficacy in the treatment of certain psychiatric conditions like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so as a result, there's been this kind of resurgence in the interest that researchers have in a variety of substances, but including MDMA, not only regarding just their pharmacologies and the sort of basic, neurobiology, the basic science, but also their potential clinical applications, right? And there are a couple of reasons for this, not the least of which being what seem to be those lasting changes, right? Those sustained changes in, deep social bonds or out, worldview and stuff like that. And so in fact, an organization called MAPS is currently recruiting participants for a second phase 3 clinical trial of MDMA for the treatment of PTSD. It's been pretty stellar results, or pretty encouraging results that they've gotten to date. And they're gearing up for what may be the final clinical trial that will need to take place before the FDA grants approval, so that, this could be a medication. And they're focusing on PTSD for right now, but I'm pretty sure it's safe to say the assumption is that it's not going to be restricted to only PTSD if it is ultimately approved. Okay, so that's a sort of very, very broad and brief background on MDMA, as well, a little bit of its history. I feel like it's just helpful to understand where this group is coming from. So with that said, back to the publication for today. So this group published their observations from a very limited experiment, to be clear, right? And so here's what they did. They administered a single dose of MDMA, okay? And, like I said, it's not a particularly major experiment, which is, again, that's why this is called a correspondence. But it's the results that were interesting from just this single MDMA administration. So the participant received the MDMA under double-blind conditions, and so he had no real expectations regarding what it was, he was receiving. He not only didn't know if he was receiving an actual psychoactive substance or placebo, but he was also only told that he might receive a stimulant, a sedative, or a placebo, right? So didn't even know that it might be MDMA. So, pretty tough to set expectations regarding what effects would emerge based on such limited, information, right? And so he was administered 1.5 milligrams per kilogram, mg per kg, of MDMA, okay? Meaning for every kilogram that he weighed, he'd get about 1.5 he would get 1.5 milligrams. That's what we mean by milligram per kilogram. So, for a 150-pound guy, that'd be, a bit over 100 milligrams of MDMA, right? And, to be clear, that's a pretty average dose that people might take under recreational settings, right? It's not super high, but it's, definitely not super low, definitely not super conservative. So, the real deal, he got a real dose. And so, it was a pretty full-blown dose of MDMA. And so the reason I think this group decided to publish this correspondence is who this person was. And I don't know that they knew this when recruiting. But so here's quoting from the article, quote, "The participant had been a leader of a white supremacist organization and had recently experienced significant distress when his identity was publicly revealed on the internet." End quote. So he was doxxed. And so that's where politics comes into the picture. Okay. So this is an individual who is, approaching this experience with I think it's safe to say, a pretty defined political ideology, right? And after receiving a single dose, just one dose of MDMA, this study participant had a pretty thoroughly transformative experience. And so here are some more quotes from the participant. And, it's a little long, but I feel like it sort of illustrates the main reason that they were interested in putting this out, right? Publishing this correspondence. So, quoting the participant, quote, "After college, I found I wasn't doing well as a lot of friends. I was kind of lost in life. When I was exposed, I lost my job. Everyone in my personal life cut me out. I had frequent panic attacks, lost weight. My whole future was really uncertain, but I wanted to stand firm as long as I could. I didn't just want to totally surrender until I had the experience in your study. I felt in that moment that all of my priorities in my life were just so messed up. The way I was interacting with people, particularly people who are close to me. But there was also an almost euphoric feeling, a feeling of love, and I concluded that was the sort of feeling that I should strive to permeate across the world." End quote. Too bad he didn't get any MDMA earlier in life. Yeah, right. But it's pretty wild that it was just one dose, right? And so, this is a guy who's affiliated with a rather overt political ideology. And after an experience with this particular substance, with MDMA, in what sounded like a period of fairly significant distress, right, of crisis, he reconsidered his affiliations. And so, as the scientists acknowledge, the participant reported experiencing euphoria, right? But it's not like euphoria is super unique to MDMA, right? Essentially, every stimulant induces at least some euphoria, and certainly the ones that people consume recreationally, right? Amphetamine, methamphetamine. But also caffeine can induce a little bit of euphoria, right? So it's not like it's just the effect of the euphoria that's likely having this, inducing this radical shift in political affiliation. So as the scientists note, it's fairly rare for people experiencing other stimulants to have these kinds of transformative experiences, right? Or at least lasting transformative experiences, ones that are sustained beyond just the effects of the drug. So to quote the scientists, quote, "The subject reported euphoria, a feature of many dopaminergic stimulant drugs such as amphetamines." Dopaminergic means dopamine related or affecting dopamine. Continuing the quote, "Yet other stimulant drugs rarely produce such transformative experiences," right? So it's a fair observation, right? It's not like, people associate, life-changing positive, in particular, realizations or the intense feelings of connectedness and being, one with the universe with cocaine or methamphetamine, right? But it's not like MDMA is the only substance that increases serotonin signaling, right? So you might think, okay, maybe it's, dopamine and the catecholamine neurotransmitters that are inducing this euphoria, but we know MDMA has this effect on serotonin, so maybe it's just the serotonin signaling. But we have other drugs that do that, right? So, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, drugs like fluoxetine, Prozac, or citalopram, or, Celexa, sertraline, Zoloft, all of these drugs increase serotonin levels after being ingested the first time. And, to be clear, like SSRIs most definitely don't increase serotonin signaling or release nearly as rapidly as MDMA does, or to the same, at the same magnitude. But they absolutely increase serotonin concentrations after just one administration. Like, we literally measured those increased concentrations for some of the research I did in the lab. After someone takes their first dose of Prozac, serotonin concentrations will increase. And the fact that the antidepressant, effects of those medications take longer than just, that immediate rise in serotonin signaling is something that continues, frankly, to vex neuropharmacology researchers and depression researchers to this day, right? But anyway, so, we know from these medications, these SSRIs, that just increasing serotonin concentrations, medications like Prozac or Zoloft, they reliably do that, doesn't induce, the kinds of empathy and connectedness that MDMA induces, right? I don't think anybody would call Prozac an empathogen or an entactogen. People taking their first prescribed dose of Prozac don't exactly resemble people taking Molly for their first time, right? And so, even beyond recreational stimulants like, amphetamine, medications that we know elevate, serotonin concentrations, isn't exactly the secret sauce, right? So just elevating, serotonin concentrations isn't the secret sauce underlying the effects of MDMA that at least this study participant is describing, and that we all sort of associate with MDMA. And so the scientists who wrote this correspondence bring up an interesting aspect of MDMA's pharmacology that I honestly hadn't really taken seriously, despite being interested in the effects for many, many years. And also this is potentially relevant to the clinical applications. And so the authors highlight that MDMA elevates levels of a hormone called oxytocin. And so, it's just a correspondence, right? So they don't really get into the pharmacology of how MDMA elevates oxytocin levels, but, that's what I'm here for, right? So I recall seeing that there was some effect of the molecule of MDMA on oxytocin signaling. But a group out of Australia showed that MDMA essentially induces increased activation of the neurons that release oxytocin, suggesting that that's probably how it is that by binding serotonin receptors, by the way, but and that's probably the mechanism by which MDMA would elevate oxytocin signaling, in addition to the serotonergic signaling as well as the dopaminergic, catecholaminergic signaling, the dopamine, norepinephrine. And so, I know this article title is almost like just entirely gibberish for people who are unfamiliar with the jargon, but it is much simpler than it may look. So basically what this group found at the bottom here in Australia, they found that when they prevented MDMA from interacting with specific receptors that it would normally bind, they didn't see the elevated oxytocin activation that they'd seen when they, didn't block it. So it's sort of like if you're trying to figure out, if you're like an alien, you're trying to figure out, what part of a car enables people to determine the direction in which it's moving. You would interfere with various things, right? You might prevent the driver from stepping down on the gas pedal, right? The car doesn't move at all. So probably not the thing that determines the direction of the driving because the car isn't even driving at all. So then you prevent the driver from pressing down on the brake pedal. Not the thing that determines the direction of driving because the car just veers off into oblivion because it can't stop, right? But can still change direction. And so then you prevent the driver from being able to turn the steering wheel. And that's it, right? The driver, could start and stop the car, just couldn't change direction. So it's similar sort of situation with what this group did here to figure out how it is that MDMA elevates oxytocin signaling. They just prevented the one thing that MDMA seemed to be doing to elevate activation of oxytocin-producing neurons by blocking its ability to interact with a specific receptor, a specific serotonin receptor, as I said, the 5-HT1A receptor, if you're interested. And that prevented the elevated activation of oxytocin-producing neurons. Okay, so we've known that MDMA can at least activate the neurons that produce oxytocin, and it does it via binding receptors. We know it can bind serotonin receptors. So back to the main article for today, the correspondence. The love and interpersonal connectedness that this former white supremacist leader in this article experiences, after being administered MDMA may have something to do with all the effects of the substance on serotonergic, dopaminergic, noradrenergic, or norepinephrine signaling, but it's the oxytocinergic signaling that may be rather critical to the types of experiences that, this gentleman not only experienced, but what distinguishes MDMA from other very closely related structures, right? Or substances. Again, like, MDMA, methamphetamine and amphetamine, the structures are quite similar. So it might be that just its capability, it is indeed its ability to interact with serotonin targets, receptors specifically, but it's the downstream consequence of that interaction, the elevated oxytocin. Okay, so to be clear, the authors of this study don't really explore that whole suggestion the way we just did. That wasn't the point of their correspondence, right? As most people, in the field who are familiar with the substance would, likely have those possibilities come to mind, right? It doesn't, you don't really have to think too hard if you're, in neuropharmacology to suspect maybe oxytocin has something to do with this. But they do take the article in a fun direction. And I just want to quote them on this one. So, quote, "The observation that a pharmacological manipulation can moderate extremist political views raises questions about how the extremist views are acquired and sustained. If a single drug experience can lead an individual to question social values, does this suggest that there is a biological basis for hate-driven political views?" And so, in other words, if a single exposure to a substance that modifies a person's state of consciousness can fundamentally alter their political worldview, just how immutable are political views or even worldviews, right? And to take it a step further, just how rigid are our own worldviews in general, right? Just how rigid is your own concept of who you are, or of who you love or care for the most, right? It's a sort of a perilous thing to consider a little bit, right? So, these are some of the most kind of like foundational aspects of our consciousness. But if it just takes one exposure to one substance to fundamentally, dislodge somebody's worldview, it sort of reveals both a bit about the worldview, but also about the biological basis of that worldview. Okay, so back to quoting the participant who was administered MDMA, former white supremacist, right? White supremacist up to his experience with being exposed to MDMA. Okay, so quote, "The experience made me realize that there's a different way of looking at things, different ways of perceiving life, the world. It made me realize my relationships with my family, friends, previous romantic relations, the way I was carrying myself in those relationships was just expletive up, right? Just messed up." So, end quote. So, as we noted earlier, this participant was the leader of a white supremacist organization, of some sort. They don't really say which one it was or anything, but he'd also, evidently been doxxed by an anti-fascist organization. So, meaning like his private, if you're not familiar with what that means, his private or previously anonymous information was made public. Okay, so reflecting on those concerns, here's another quote from the participant. "I knew when I was under the influence of the drug that I had to reach out to Antifa to get the docs down. But there was part of me that understood, empathized with them. I realized why they did what they did. In addition to it showing you about human connection, I think the drug opens you up in a way. So I held off until that evening. But I did email them that evening and began a conversation. We're still conversing to this day, hundreds of emails back and forth about my life, about the guy who doxed me and his life. That's been a really meaningful process talking to him," end quote. And then he later says, this was a while back, right, that this happened. And he says, you can't just flip the switch on these kinds of beliefs that, are tied to extremely, primitive and subconscious processes, right? He's almost certainly right about that. The level of depth that underlies why some people are, or it's totally non-political, like why it is that some people are afraid of spiders or cockroaches, or experience intense disgust at seeing another human being abused or mistreated, or extreme disgust at seeing a cockroach, right? These things are almost beyond your conscious control. And so, modifying reactions at that level, and those same types of processes are certainly involved in what determine our political affiliations, our beliefs, our worldviews. And so, modifying reactions at that level of consciousness is far more complicated than just reminding you, of some information, right? Reminding you that the capital of Pennsylvania isn't Philadelphia, it's Harrisburg, or the capital of Florida isn't Miami, it's Tallahassee, right? I'm sure you all already knew that, but I've had conversations with people who are like, Philadelphia seriously isn't the capital of Pennsylvania? By the way, Philadelphia was at one point the capital of the United States. The more you know. But anyways, so, we're not talking about, those instances where somebody's just like, okay. We're talking about life, universe-shattering, paradigm-shifting changes in how people view the world, right? That's the kind of effect that this guy experienced. And it's the kind of thing that made this group of scientists publish these observations, right, in this correspondence. However, there's a quote from the article that is both exciting as well as like slightly horrifying. And we're starting from a sentence I quoted earlier. Okay, so, quote, "If a single drug experience can lead an individual to question social values, does this suggest that there's a biological basis for hate-driven political views?" Right? Okay. And then this is the interesting part. Quote, "For example, are extremist views fueled by fear, anger, and cognitive biases? And if so, might these be targets for pharmacological intervention?" Okay, end quote. So, without getting into specific political predispositions that anybody might have, who's seeing this, there's a whole body of research that explores the relationships between biology and genetics and politics, and I've actually explored that in another podcast episode, which I've linked below. But the sort of short story is that it is far from a purely rational byproduct of our behavior, our politics, right? There's all kinds of biological baggage about which we're almost certainly completely unaware, and engaging that kind of baggage is extremely difficult, right? Very subconscious, very primitive, and it varies between people, right? And it correlated with certain political affiliations and ideals. Okay, so back to the study. So the scientists note that, importantly, the study participants' experiences and realizations were sustained. The reason that quote strikes me as maybe a little bit horrifying is just the notion that we would treat certain political extremist, even political views, as we would pathologize them or medicalize them or potentially target them pharmacologically, right? That's pretty crazy. Not entirely too great of a departure from certain, post-apocalyptic, sci-fi novels, right? Okay. Anyways, back to the study. So the scientists note that, again, the study participants' experiences and realizations were sustained, right? So it wasn't just over the course of the experience with MDMA. It lasted much longer. I mean, it continues, theoretically. It's not exactly an effect that's shared by its amphetamine cousin. So, people might have, realizations on amphetamine, but they're not as sustained as they seem to potentially be with MDMA. Importantly, 8 months later, the participant reported some difficulty in maintaining those positive feelings that he was describing, right, in his daily life. And so as far as we're aware, the participant hadn't been receiving any kind of sustained contact with the scientists who were studying his reaction to MDMA. By the way, it sounds like the group was literally studying the effects of MDMA on social touch, which is a thing that's studied. Here's a paper about it. And I have to admit, this is a study I almost certainly wouldn't have checked out, but I was curious about this domain of MDMA and social touch. It's interesting, right? So notice, and this is what you get for having a scientist go through this with you. Take a look at the authors of the study that I just put up there, right? And then take a look at the authors of the main study we discussed today. Some shared people, right? And so, to be clear, Neuropsychopharmacology, which is the journal in which this is published, this actual research article is published, it's also a super solid journal in neuroscience. And so in this correspondence, what we're seeing is a sneak peek into some of the data that these two experts, right, on the broader effects of MDMA, Harriet DeWitt and Anya Bershad, the data they've been collecting. They're at the University of Chicago, I believe. And so in my opinion, at least, I think it's incredibly interesting that this kind of research is being conducted. And, maybe we'll even explore this publication that dives into how a substance can radically influence, the way that being touched by another person is experienced, another day. It's super interesting, really interesting stuff. But anyway, so what do we learn from this correspondence? It's certainly not the same as a study that's really a compilation of of experiments that have undergone peer review and everything. It's this is really just the kind of thing that scientists observe in the lab and generates a sort of really kind of moment, right? And it's those kinds of moments, though, that can often lead to the more interesting and transformative efforts in research, right? It's just those curious observations that are made in the lab. That said, beyond that, it gives us, at least a clue as to how it is that a substance like MDMA may be, can influence, incredibly personal and meaningful aspects of a person's worldview that pretty much aren't typically available for, interrogation or, influence, right? It's really, really difficult to, change a person's mind on something that they hold, a belief that they hold so dearly with which they define themselves, right? And so I think this correspondence gives us a clue as to how fragile those worldviews can be under certain circumstances. And it also helps to reveal that, all these aspects of our consciousness, even the things to which we tie our identities, the most closely, they may be shaken or shattered by just a mild adjustment of a few neurotransmitters here and there, right? And if those things can be rattled by just, turning up the volume on a few neurotransmitters, what else can be altered by modifying other processes in the brain? All right, that's what I got for you today. Sort of a short one, I know, but thanks for watching. If you're up for exploring these kinds of topics with me in the future and learning along with me, you might consider tapping the subscribe button. Otherwise, have a good one, and I will see you next weekend. Oh, cool. Okay, so yeah, I'm guessing MDMA doesn't have the same sexual side effects as SSRIs. Well, it can. So not quite, not to the same extent, but it does induce erectile dysfunction. It's a stimulant, right? So it the same way that amphetamine does, cocaine does, but unfortunately, it also does induce libido. Right? So it does actually increase libido, but it makes it, at least for males, a little bit more difficult to quench that that increase. Whereas SSRIs, not only can induce erectile dysfunction, but also just decrease libido. So yeah, they're different there. I remember I used to experience love and interpersonal relationships in the past. It was nice. Do you suffer from Trump derangement syndrome? Try Molly. Clinical studies have proven Molly's effectiveness with patients with TDS. The side effects may include increased empathy and understanding of other people's points of view, right? Makes you question how much of your identity is subject to being constructed of just chemicals. Yeah, absolutely. And like, even beyond just chemicals, right? Like I 100% agree with you. And I find that to be, arguably the most fascinating thing to contemplate. But it also implies that like other things that aren't, substances, that aren't drugs, that have some kind of, intended effect on this, this kind of signaling, theoretically can also, rattle a person's, worldview, in super intense experiences, right? I mean, that's perhaps a bit more intuitive, right? Like I think we all intuitively associate, world or life-changing experiences as the things that really construct how we think about ourselves. So that totally makes sense. But like, in terms of if the goal is to try and change somebody's mind politically or, in business or something like that, it is just an interesting thing to contemplate that like, these things that we think or that we perceive, particularly now, as being so, immutable, they're not, right? Or at least in some cases. All right. Thanks for watching, everybody. I will see you next weekend. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. See you, everybody.